Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Please subscribe. Thank you. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ruins of what had once been a bustling metropolis. Now, it was a shell of its former self, a haunting reminder of a world that had fallen to ruin. The streets were deserted, except for the occasional shuffle of the undead. Buildings stood in a state of decay, windows shattered, and streets overgrown with weeds. The air was thick with the scent of rot, both human and otherwise. Maya, a young woman in her late 20s, crouched behind a broken pillar, her breath shallow and steady. She was watching the city square through a crack in the rubble, her dark eyes scanning for movement. Her hand gripped the handle of a worn machete, and a small backpack was slung over her shoulder, filled with essentials, food, water, and a few precious weapons. The world she had known was gone. Now, all that mattered was survival. The zombies had come without warning, a terrifying tide that swept across the globe. No one had expected it. No one had been prepared. Within weeks, society had crumbled. Governments fell, armies scattered, and humanity had been reduced to a fragmented, desperate group of survivors, constantly on the run. The undead were relentless, their numbers swelling by the day. The few who remained had learned to fight back, to adapt. But survival in a world ruled by the infected was no easy feat. Maya's group had managed to find shelter in an abandoned underground facility, hidden from the eyes of the zombies. They had learned to move in silence, to stay out of sight, and to avoid the hordes that roamed the earth above. But it wasn't the zombies that terrified Maya the most. It was the other survivors, the desperate, sometimes cruel humans who were willing to do anything to stay alive. She had lost everything, her family, her home, her old life. And now, every day was a struggle to stay one step ahead of both the undead and the living who would take advantage of her weakness. She had learned not to trust anyone easily, to always be ready for the worst. It had been a long time since she had seen any sign of hope, and the days seemed to blur together. The only constant was the need to survive, to keep moving, to keep fighting. Today, she was out scavenging, searching for supplies that could keep her alive for another few days. The rest of her group was back at the base, tending to their wounds and preparing for the next journey. They had heard rumors of a safe zone, a place where the undead were kept at bay, but it seemed too good to be true. Maya had always been skeptical, but she would follow any lead that might offer even a glimmer of hope. The distant moan of a zombie echoed through the street, and Maya tensed, her body going rigid as she scanned the area. A lone figure shuffled into view, its eyes vacant, its skin pale and decomposing. She held her breath, watching its movements carefully. It was far enough away that she didn't need to act, but she knew better than to take chances. One wrong move could cost her everything. As the zombie passed, Maya slowly exhaled, her heart racing in her chest. She waited until it was out of sight before she moved again, slipping into the street, keeping low to avoid detection. The square was a graveyard of wreckage, but there was still a chance. If she could find a few more cans of food, maybe even some medical supplies, she could make it back to the group. But something caught her eye, a flicker of movement in the distance. A figure, crouched low, its silhouette barely visible against the dimming sky. Maya froze, her instincts screaming at her. Was it a survivor, or was it something more dangerous? She couldn't take any risks. She reached for her machete, the cold steel a comforting presence in her hand as she waited for the figure to reveal itself. The figure didn't move at first, as if waiting for something. Maya's pulse quickened, and every instinct in her body screamed for her to stay hidden. She pressed herself against the remnants of a collapsed storefront, the crumbled bricks scraping against her back as she tried to steady her breath. Was it a trap? The undead were often mindless, but there were still pockets of human survivors, some kind, but far too many who were ruthless and dangerous. She squinted, trying to make out any detail. The figure shifted slightly, a subtle movement, but it was enough. It wasn't a zombie, its gait was too deliberate. Maya's fingers tightened around the machete, the familiar weight giving her a momentary sense of calm. This was another survivor, no doubt about it. But what kind of survivor? The figure stepped into a patch of waning sunlight, revealing a tall man, rugged, with a weathered face and a scar running down the side of his neck. He wore a dirty leather jacket and carried a makeshift spear, his eyes scanning the area with a wariness that mirrored Maya's own. He wasn't looking for food or shelter, he was hunting. Maya's grip on her machete loosened just a fraction, but she didn't make a move yet. She had to be sure. If this man was part of one of the raider groups that roamed the city, she'd be dead before she even had a chance to react. The man paused, his head tilting slightly as if he had sensed her presence, though she hadn't made a sound. His eyes scanned the street again, then flicked toward the shadows where Maya hid. He took a step forward, his spear held at the ready, his expression cold and calculating. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her first thought was to retreat, to slip away into the labyrinth of alleyways that sprawled through the city, but then she stopped herself. The man was already aware of her. Running would only make her a target. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every muscle coiled tight, ready to spring into action. The tension in the air was palpable, as though everything in the ruined city had come to a standstill. The zombie groans had faded into the background, but they were always there, lurking. She had no time to think about them now. It was this man, or nothing. "You're not alone, are you?" The man's voice broke the silence, rough and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to another human in far too long. Maya didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but she needed to know more. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "Name's Jared." His eyes narrowed as he glanced over the desolate square. "Not looking for trouble, if that's what you're thinking. Just trying to survive, like everyone else." Maya's mind raced. The way he spoke made her think of the survivors who had once been part of her group, those who knew how to hide their desperation behind a mask of civility. She'd seen too many like him, people who had lost everything and would do anything to take from others, even if they didn't look like raiders at first glance. Jared took a cautious step forward. "I don't mean you any harm. I saw you moving through the square, and I thought you might know where there's food or supplies." Maya's hand tightened around her machete again, but she forced herself to relax, watching him closely. Was he telling the truth? Or was this some trick to catch her off guard? "I'm not giving anything away," she replied, her voice firm. "Not until I know who I'm dealing with." Jared chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Fair enough. Look, I've got no use for confrontation. Just haven't found anyone who doesn't want to rob me blind. But if you're on your own, you're going to need help. I've got a place, small, safe. You'll have a better chance there." Maya hesitated. The offer was tempting, but it could be a trap. She knew the rules of survival in this new world, and trust was a rare commodity. Still, something about Jared felt different. He wasn't like the others. There was a weariness in his eyes, a hint of something broken, but not in a way that made him dangerous. Before she could respond, a sound echoed through the city, the unmistakable shuffle of the undead. Maya's eyes snapped to the direction of the noise. Jared stiffened, his hand tightening on his spear. "We're not alone," he muttered. A low growl sounded nearby, then another, and before Maya could react, a small horde of zombies rounded a corner, their eyes locked on the living. The tension in the air snapped, and Maya didn't hesitate. She turned to Jared, her face hardening. "Move," she barked, and together, they sprinted toward the nearest alley, the undead close behind. Maya's heart hammered in her chest as she and Jared raced down the narrow alley, the sound of shuffling feet growing louder behind them. She could hear the moans of the undead, a chorus of death that sent chills through her spine. There were too many. Their relentless pursuit was like a ticking clock, each moment that passed brought them closer to being overwhelmed. The alley twisted and turned, debris littering the ground. Maya's boots skidded on the wet pavement, her breath ragged as she pushed herself harder. Jared's long strides were just ahead, his eyes darting over his shoulder every few seconds, calculating their chances of escape. They had to keep moving. The moment they stopped, it would be over. There's an abandoned building up ahead, Jared called over his shoulder, his voice strained but clear. We can take shelter there and regroup. Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They needed to outrun the zombies first, then figure out what to do next. Her legs burned, the muscles protesting with every step, but she pushed through the pain. Survival was all that mattered. She couldn't afford to slow down now. As they neared the building, Maya's eyes scanned the street ahead. The sun had nearly set, casting the world in an eerie twilight. Shadows stretched long, and the streets grew darker with each passing second. The building Jared had pointed out loomed ahead, an old office complex, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. They reached the entrance just as the first of the zombies appeared in the alley's opening. The rotten, decomposing figures shuffled closer, their limbs jerking with unnatural movements. Maya's pulse quickened, but she didn't falter. With a final burst of energy, she reached the door and pushed it open with all her strength. The metal groaned, but it gave way, and they slipped inside just as the undead closed in. The building was eerily quiet, the stale air heavy with the scent of decay. Maya quickly surveyed the interior, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in through broken windows. It was a shell of a place, empty offices, overturned desks, and old paperwork scattered across the floor. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Jared had already moved toward the back of the building, his movements swift and practiced. Maya followed, her machete still in hand, her senses alert. She could feel the tension in the air, both from the zombies that were now crowding outside the building and the stranger who had just saved her life. But despite the uncertainty, she knew one thing for sure: she was alive, and that was all that mattered. They found a small office near the back, and Jared quickly closed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment to catch his breath. Maya leaned against the wall, still trying to calm her racing heart. She was aware of every sound, the distant groans of the undead outside, the soft creak of the building's aging structure. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a moment of peace. So, Jared finally spoke, his voice quieter now. Looks like we're stuck here for a while. Maya glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. Why did you help me? She asked bluntly. You don't know me. I could have been one of them, a trap for you to fall into. Jared shrugged, his expression unreadable. Maybe. But I didn't have much choice. I've been out here too long, and I'm not stupid enough to let a chance slip by when it's staring me in the face. You look like you can handle yourself, and that's more than I can say for most people these days. Maya considered his words, still unsure of whether she should trust him. But something about him felt different. He didn't have the usual desperation that most survivors carried in their eyes. He had the look of someone who had lost everything but still held on to a shred of decency. It was hard to find that these days. I'm not asking for a partnership, Maya said finally, breaking the silence. But if you have any food, now's the time to share. Jared smirked. I've got a bit of dried meat and some water. Not much, but it'll get us through the night. He rummaged through his bag, pulling out a small ration pack and a half-empty bottle of water. You're welcome to share. Maya didn't hesitate. Hunger gnawed at her insides, and she took the ration pack gratefully. As she ate, she kept an eye on the door, listening for any signs of the undead. It was quiet, too quiet. The city outside was never truly silent anymore, but for now, they were safe. So, what now? Jared asked, settling down against the wall across from her. We wait for morning? Or do we try to keep moving? Maya wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, considering the options. We can't stay here long. The longer we're in one place, the more likely it is someone, zombie or otherwise, will find us. Jared nodded. Fair point. So, we get out at first light, try to find whatever supplies we can. And maybe we get out of this hellhole altogether. Maya looked at him, her eyes sharp. You're not talking about leaving the city, are you? There's nothing left out there. Jared met her gaze. I've heard rumors. People say there's a place, a sanctuary where the undead don't go. It's a long shot, but what else is there? Maya paused, the idea of hope making her uneasy. But something inside her stirred, a spark she hadn't felt in ages. She wasn't ready to give up just yet. "All right," she said, standing up and tightening the strap on her backpack. "We'll go. But if you're lying, Jared, I'll leave you behind." Jared gave her a grim smile. "Wouldn't expect anything less." As night fell, they settled in for an uneasy sleep, the world outside a never-ending nightmare. But for the first time in a long time, Maya had a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The sun barely peeked over the horizon the next morning, casting long streaks of light across the desolate streets. Maya and Jared had barely slept, each of them alert to every creak and groan from the old building around them. The tension in the air had never lifted, but now it was time to move. There was no point in staying hidden any longer. Maya grabbed her machete, checking the blade one last time, her eyes scanning the room for anything useful they might have missed. She had learned the hard way that even the smallest item could make a difference in this new world. Jared, on the other hand, was already up and moving, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his spear in hand. He seemed calm, methodical, as though he had done this countless times before. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Maya nodded, tightening her grip on her machete. "Let's go. The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." They made their way out of the office, stepping cautiously through the building's crumbling halls. The place still smelled of rot, and the distant sounds of the undead could be heard from outside, but there was no immediate danger. For now, the street outside was clear. The world felt empty, the kind of emptiness that made every movement seem like a potential death sentence. Jared led the way, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings as they stepped out into the street. "Stay close," he murmured, and Maya did, her steps silent on the cracked pavement. The silence between them was heavy, but neither of them felt the need to speak. They both understood the gravity of their situation. There was no room for small talk in a world where survival was all that mattered. The air was thick with the knowledge that every decision they made could mean the difference between life and death. They moved quickly, sticking to the alleys where the shadows provided cover. Maya kept her machete ready, every sense alert, while Jared's spear remained steady in his hands. They had no destination other than survival. Finding supplies and staying one step ahead of the zombies was all they could focus on for now. As they moved deeper into the city, the signs of destruction grew more apparent. Vehicles overturned in the middle of the street, doors torn off their hinges, and the occasional distant scream echoed through the air. But there was something else, something that hadn't been there the night before. The feeling of being watched. Maya paused, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the street ahead. "You feel that?" she asked quietly. Jared's eyes darted around, his posture tense. "Yeah. We're not alone." A low growl sounded from behind a row of abandoned buildings, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet. Maya's hand instinctively went to her machete, her muscles tensing. They weren't the only survivors in this part of the city. And from the sound of it, whoever was following them wasn't interested in making friends. "We should move," Jared whispered, his voice tight. "Fast." They broke into a run, heading down a side street that led into the heart of the city. The undead weren't far behind, and the faintest sounds of movement told them that other humans were closing in as well. Maya could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The last thing she wanted was to face more raiders, but the thought of being caught by zombies was worse. Jared turned sharply, taking them down a narrow alley that led to an underground subway entrance. The door was hanging off its hinges, the metal frame rusted and bent, but it was the only option they had. Maya was close on his heels, her breath ragged as they descended into the dark, the flickering light from above barely illuminating the way. They stopped at the bottom of the stairs, both of them listening carefully. The sound of shuffling feet was louder now, echoing from above. Zombies. And judging by the sound of voices, they were also being pursued by something worse, other survivors. We need to find cover, Maya said, her voice urgent. Jared nodded. Follow me. He led them deeper into the subway system, past rusted trains and broken platforms. The smell of dampness and decay filled the air, and the faint hum of distant moans could be heard in the background. But for now, the darkness of the tunnels provided them with a temporary reprieve. They crouched behind a pile of debris, trying to control their breathing and stay as quiet as possible. Maya's eyes met Jared's, and she could see the uncertainty in his gaze. This is getting out of hand, she muttered. We can't keep running like this. Jared didn't respond immediately. He was too busy listening for any sounds of danger. The groans of the undead seemed to come from all directions, but there was something else, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful, as though they were being stalked. A voice broke through the silence, cold and sharp. I know you're down there. Maya's heart stopped. The voice was unmistakable, another survivor, and judging by the tone, not one who was inclined to talk things out. Maya reached for her machete, her body tensing. Jared grabbed her arm, his grip firm but urgent. Stay calm, he whispered. Don't make a sound. But it was too late. The voice continued, growing closer. You two don't get to hide forever. Come out, and I won't kill you. Maya's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The zombies outside were a problem, but it was the humans who were the real danger. If they were cornered, they'd be lucky to survive the encounter. Jared turned to her, his face hard. We need a plan. Fast. Maya nodded. Her fingers wrapped around the machete hilt, her mind racing for a solution. They had to outsmart them. The zombies were a danger, but if they could lead the survivors to the undead, they might be able to escape. But time was running out. The footsteps were getting closer, and there was no more room to hide. We move now, she whispered, as the footsteps grew louder. And we make sure they regret it. The tension was unbearable as Maya and Jared crouched low behind the debris, the sound of the footsteps growing ever closer. The voice from above echoed through the subway tunnels, sharp and demanding, urging them to come out. But Maya wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. They were being hunted, and she refused to become a victim. Her mind raced as she glanced around the darkened tunnel. The smell of damp earth and mildew filled the air, a constant reminder of how long the city had been abandoned. She could hear the groans of zombies in the distance, but they weren't the immediate threat. No, it was the survivors above who had found them, and they had no intention of letting them go. Jared's voice was barely a whisper. They're coming. We need to move. Maya nodded, keeping her movements as silent as possible. If they could just find a way to make it out of the subway and back into the maze of alleyways, they might stand a chance. But they couldn't stay here for long. The survivors would be close, and if they were smart, they'd have weapons. The next few moments were a blur of calculated decisions. Maya's fingers gripped her machete tightly, her eyes scanning the shadows. If they were going to survive, they had to outsmart these people. And the zombies? They could use them as a distraction. Jared didn't waste any time. With a subtle signal, he began to move, pulling Maya along behind him. They slipped further down the subway tunnel, the sound of the survivors' footsteps drawing nearer. Maya could feel her pulse pounding in her neck, but she forced herself to stay calm, moving with purpose. The only way out was forward. They reached an abandoned train car further down the tracks. It was an old, rusted model, but it had enough cover to hide behind. Jared motioned for Maya to crouch behind it, and they both ducked low, listening carefully. The footsteps above had stopped for a moment, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the survivors realized they weren't going to simply walk out and surrender. Maya's eyes darted to the entrance of the subway, calculating the best route. If they could time it right, they could use the zombies as a distraction and slip past their pursuers. But the real question was whether or not the zombies would cooperate. Do you think they'll be able to hear us? Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. Jared shook his head. The sound of the undead is all over the place. We'll be fine as long as we stay quiet. Maya wasn't so sure. But there was no time for doubt now. The voice from above called out again, growing closer. We know you're down there. There's no way out except through us. You better come out now, or we'll make you. It wasn't a threat, there was no question in their tone. These survivors weren't negotiating. They were hunting. Maya's mind worked quickly, and then the plan formed, risky, but it was the only shot they had. Follow me, she whispered to Jared. When I say go, we run. Jared gave a brief nod, his expression hardening. He understood. This wasn't a time for hesitation. They waited, counting the seconds as the voice grew louder and the steps closer. Then, when Maya could sense the survivors were almost directly above them, she made her move. Go, she hissed. They burst from behind the train car, running full speed toward the subway's exit. Maya could hear Jared's footsteps pounding behind her, his spear in hand. There was no time for looking back, no time to think about what could go wrong. Maya sprinted ahead, heart in her throat, knowing the undead were just a few steps behind. She could hear their hungry groans, echoing in the tunnels, but she didn't slow down. She had to outrun the survivors and the zombies both. Then, just as they neared the stairs that led back up to the street, Maya heard the unmistakable shuffle of the undead closing in. The sound of their ragged breath, the slap of decaying feet against the pavement, something primal within her surged, spurring her to push even harder. They had to make it. Jared was right behind her, the urgency of their escape propelling them forward. The stairs were within sight, but there was still a gap between them and freedom. Maya could hear the survivors following close behind, their voices now rising in frustration as they realized their prey was slipping away. But then, something changed. The sound of the zombies' groans grew louder, closer. It was the moment Maya had been waiting for. Without warning, she skidded to a stop at the bottom of the stairs, drawing her machete with a sharp motion. She spun, facing the entrance of the subway, and in that moment, everything fell into place. The survivors were halfway down the stairs, their eyes wide with realization as they saw what was coming. But it was too late. The zombies had heard them, and like a wave, they poured into the tunnel, their decomposing bodies colliding with the living. Chaos erupted in a violent, snarling frenzy. Maya didn't wait to watch the carnage unfold. She grabbed Jared's arm, pulling him up the stairs with all her strength. The moment they reached the top, they didn't look back. They ran into the streets, where the faint light of the morning sun barely pierced the overcast sky. They didn't stop until they reached the relative safety of a nearby alleyway, out of breath and shaking from the close call. But as the sound of distant screams and moans echoed behind them, Maya realized something. They were alive. For now. The road ahead was still dangerous, survivors, zombies, and the uncertain future. But as she caught her breath and glanced at Jared, a fleeting sense of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them to find the sanctuary they had been searching for. We keep moving, Maya said, her voice steady. We can't stop now. Jared nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. Agreed. Let's go. They turned down another alley, their eyes focused on the road ahead. The world was still broken, but for the first time in a long time, they had hope. The city streets were eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant groans of zombies searching for any lingering survivors. The chaos of their recent escape still lingered in the back of Maya's mind, but she forced herself to focus. Each step they took felt like a victory, each moment of survival another inch closer to the sanctuary they both desperately hoped existed. Jared walked ahead of her, his pace steady, his eyes always scanning their surroundings. Despite the danger that loomed around every corner, there was a calmness to his movements that Maya found strangely reassuring. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. What now? Maya asked, breaking the silence between them. She was tired, exhausted even, but the drive to keep moving pushed her forward. We keep heading west, Jared replied without looking back. There's a place, it's not far. People have been talking about it for months. If it's real, it's the only chance we've got. Maya wasn't sure if she believed him. She had heard the same rumors before. Survivors huddled together in a safe zone, a place untouched by the undead. It sounded too good to be true. But as the weight of their journey pressed down on her, the thought of that possibility seemed like the only thing worth fighting for. They kept moving, winding through narrow alleys and abandoned storefronts, avoiding the main roads where zombies still roamed in small groups. As they moved deeper into the city, the air became thicker, the once bustling metropolis now just a shell of its former self. The buildings were collapsing, nature beginning to reclaim what humanity had left behind. Still, Maya kept her eyes fixed ahead, determined to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Eventually, the pair reached an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, its crumbling exterior hidden beneath a mass of overgrown ivy and vines. Jared stopped just before they reached the door, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. "We should rest here for a bit," he said, his voice low. "Get our bearings." Maya didn't argue. They were both on edge, their exhaustion evident in the way they moved and spoke. They needed to gather their strength if they were going to survive whatever came next. The warehouse was dark inside, but dry. The air was stale, the dust thick in the corners. They found an old, overturned crate to sit on, and Maya slumped onto it, relieved to be out of the open for the moment. "What if we're too late?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Jared looked at her, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Too late for what?" "For the sanctuary. What if it's already been overrun? What if we're just wasting our time?" Jared didn't immediately answer. He sat down next to her, leaning back against a pile of crates, his spear resting across his lap. "Maybe we are. But the alternative is staying here, waiting to be eaten alive. I've seen what happens when people give up. They get desperate. They end up fighting each other for scraps. I've been running for too long to stop now. We have to keep going." Maya glanced at him, the flicker of hope in his words striking a chord deep within her. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about fighting for something better. Something more than just existing in the ruins of the world. She nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't stop now." Jared stood up and reached for his bag, pulling out a few ration packs and a can of water. "We rest now, but after that, we keep moving. One step at a time. We can't afford to waste time. We need to find that sanctuary before it's too late." They ate in silence, the food stale but necessary. As Maya chewed, her thoughts drifted back to the streets they had just come from, to the survivors who had chased them into the subway, to the life they had once known. It seemed like a lifetime ago that the world had been whole, that civilization had felt stable. Now, all that was left was chaos, and the dead. But they still had a chance. "We'll make it," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jared. "We have to." He didn't respond immediately, but she saw the ghost of a smile cross his face. "Yeah, we will." With their rest over, they stood up and checked their gear. Maya adjusted the strap on her pack, her machete secured at her side. Jared slung his spear over his shoulder and adjusted his makeshift armor, worn but serviceable. They had no time to waste. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the warehouse as they stepped back into the streets. The city was eerily silent now, the undead nowhere in sight, but they knew better than to believe the world was still. Something was always lurking, just beyond the corner. As they moved through the city, they both knew the sanctuary was their last hope. The rumors they had heard, whispers of a place untouched by the infection, a place where survivors had rebuilt some semblance of order, were all they had left to cling to. But whether it was real or just another lie, they had to try. The road ahead was long, and the dangers still loomed in every shadow. But they had one another, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. "We'll find it," Maya said, her voice firm. Jared glanced at her, his eyes filled with the same resolve. Together. And as they ventured deeper into the city, their footsteps echoed with the quiet determination of those who refused to give in. The world may have fallen to the dead, but they were still alive. And as long as they were, they would keep fighting.